Kia ora koutou, and welcome to Climate Innovation for Aotearoa New Zealand's Built Environment. This is a panel discussion with leading built environment businesses on the sector's need for climate innovation and where it should come from as we look at our journey ahead to 2030 and 2050. The discussion is part of the inaugural Auckland Climate Festival, an open platform created to celebrate and accelerate climate action over the last 3 weeks in October and in the lead up to COP26 in Glasgow. This panel discussion is hosted by Auckland Unlimited, Auckland's economic and cultural agency, which is in the process of establishing a climate innovation hub. The Climate Innovation Hub will be a demand-led cross-sector collaboration, bringing together the organisations required to develop, demonstrate and scale the solutions needed for a climate resilient and low carbon Tamaki Makaurau in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We are hoping that the discussion this morning can help initiate a dialogue on where the need is for climate solutions that can feed into future calls and climate action. In a minute, I'll introduce you to our impressive panel, but first I'll take you through the running order for the session. And I should introduce myself. I'm Ian Short from The Connective, your host for today. Okay, so we'll start with a few words of context on climate change and the built environment before moving into short introductions of the four panelists. Each panelist will then provide a 3 to 4 minute run through on where they see the biggest challenges for the built environment sector and for their organisations on our journey to a net zero built environment. We'll then have a panel discussion for about 15 minutes and should have time for 2 or 3 questions from the audience before finishing just before 10 a.m. New Zealand time. So if you have any questions, excuse me, either now or through the discussion, please put them into the chat and Teams. So what do we mean by the built environment? The built environment includes all of the physical parts of where we live and work: homes, buildings, streets, open spaces and infrastructure. The built environment sector is a large contributor to greenhouse gas emissions from using energy in buildings, producing construction materials, constructing buildings and infrastructure, and waste from demolished buildings. It's estimated that the built environment, taking all of the above sources of emissions into account, contributes about 20% of New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions. And globally, the built environment contributes to approximately 38% of gross emissions. And despite Paris Agreement targets, emissions from the sector have been rising in the past few years. To get on track to net zero carbon building stock by 2050, the International Energy Agency estimates that by 2030, direct building CO2 emissions need to fall by 50% and indirect building sector emissions by 60%. This equates to building sector emissions falling by around 6% per year until 2030, a very tall ask given the current trajectory in the opposite direction. In New Zealand, the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment is the government lead on designing low emissions pathways for the sector via its Building for the Climate Change Work Programme. Thus far, the programme's main initiatives include 2 frameworks. First, a whole of life embodied carbon reduction framework, which proposes to set mandatory reporting and measurement requirements for whole of life carbon emissions in the building process. Second, transforming operational efficiency framework, which proposes to set required levels of efficiency for energy use and water use and define minimum indoor environmental quality measures for buildings. MBIE is also working on an adaptation framework for the built environment as part of New Zealand's National Adaptation Plan, which is due to be published in August 2022. Okay, now on to our panel. First, we have Alec Tang, Director Sustainability, Kāinga Ora. Alec is a chartered environmentalist and fellow of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. He has spent the bulk of his career developing and delivering innovative sustainability solutions across business, academia, and the public sector. Most recently, Alec's work has been focused on the creation of low carbon, resilient, and equitable urban environments, including leading Auckland's Climate Chief Sustainability Office through the development of Te Tariki a Tawhiri, Auckland's Climate Plan, and latterly as Director of Sustainability at Kāinga Ora Homes and Community. Alec also currently lectures on sustainable business at Auckland University of Technology. Our second speaker is Helen Jenkins, General Manager, Sustainability at Fletcher Building. Helen's background is in manufacturing and construction, and for the past 15 years, she has worked in the building and utilities sectors, looking at how to reduce embodied carbon and options to use more sustainable materials. Prior to that, she worked as a process improvement engineer in the manufacturing sector. In her role as Head of Sustainability with Fletcher Building, her main focus is on working with experts across the business to improve the sustainability of building materials and reduce carbon emissions. Our third speaker is Fiona Short. Fiona is a registered architect and group lead of sustainability at Warren and Mahoney Architects. Her passion is helping project teams deliver regenerative impact through their residential, civic, commercial and education projects. Fiona is currently a supervisor of PhD research into embodied carbon in New Zealand architecture. And our fourth and final speaker is joining us quite late at night from his home, not far from Milan in Italy. Sean Lockie is Director Integrated City Planning at Arup. Sean has had a 20+ year international career at the forefront of built environment sustainability and climate change solutions. Prior to joining Arup, Sean was co-founding director of the Healthy Clean Cities program at EIT Climate Kick, the European Union's largest innovation agency looking at solving the climate crisis through systems innovation. This program is activating 100 cities in Europe as part of the Green Deal to bring about radical innovation in areas such as citizen activation, procurement, policy regulation, education, production and supply chains, finance, business models and governance. Sean has also held leadership roles at Atkins, the Building Research Establishment, and is a fellow of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. And with that, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Alec Tang. Thanks, Alec.
Kia ora, Ian. Tēnā koutou katoa, tēnei te mihi kia koutou. E mihi ana au ki ngā mana whenua hurinua o Tāmaki Makaurau. Ko Alec Tang toka ingoa. Hi, everybody. Great to be here. Thanks, Ian, for the intro. So we've been asked to think about challenges for the sector and challenges for our organisation. And as I was thinking about that, actually, for me, sitting here at Kāinga Ora, the two kind of come together quite nicely because we have a strong mandate, ability, desire to transform the whole system, not just our own organisation. So for me, challenges for the sector stroke organisation, there's one around ambition, promotion, demonstration. Ian, you mentioned the Building for Climate Change program that MB's leading. That's a really important piece of work. And the question we have is, does it go far enough? Does it set the targets that we need to actually genuinely hit that 1.5 degree target that we're aiming for? Can we push harder? Can we push further? The other thing I'd say around that is the promotional bit. Those of you who read the government's emissions reduction plan, you saw that the transport arena had lots in there. The built environment didn't, but that's not a reflection of how much work is going in there. And I think there's a really important element there of being better at talking about some of the innovation, which hopefully we'll talk about, some of the moves, some of the drives. But with that, there's an importance around scaling up that demonstration. So there's lots of great projects. How do we do that at scale? How do we do that at a neighborhood level? So I think that's one really important bit, that ambition, promotion, scaling up demonstration. The other area I'll say that both as an organization and as a sector we need to do better is to think more about the broader lives that are impacted by the built environment. We often think about the structures and the systems as very physical, but there's a huge amount of opportunity, and actually there's a real direct connection between what we're building and the lives of the people in those areas. So I think that link needs to be better articulated and better demonstrated in the targets that we're setting and the investment that we're looking for. And that for me is a real organizational one. And those of you who dialed into some of the earlier webinars in this climate festival would have heard me talk about, the targets that we set ourselves or that are set by government really dictate the goals or the drive or the focus that an organization has. So we need to reflect that in the targets that we're setting. We're not just building houses for numbers. We want to build good houses in the right places that will actually meet the conditions of the future. And that's kind of a third area that I think is a big challenge, is making sure we don't just jump from the frying pan into the fire, as you say. by building lots of houses, are we building them that will be adequate in the future climate scenarios that we see, and that will not be in climate risk exposed areas, that will actually support those lives that we need for a low emissions resilient future. And so that's really important. The final two that I'll just touch on, because I think we'll talk about it later on, is how do we help the supply chain scale up? So this is massive, this is big, and we need to make sure that organizations like Kāinga Ora set expectations, which is great, but actually support our suppliers, our build partners in meeting those expectations, and how we scale up, how we build that within the whole supply chain through initiatives, through our sustainable procurement initiatives is really important. And the last one, which I'll just leave because I think it's really important that we touch upon later, is embodied carbon. And I think that's a really important element that we often forget. We think about operational emissions, but embodied carbon is one of the most important areas that we need to focus on. I think the last comment, Ian, was about good examples, and just to reflect on some things that I've mentioned earlier. I think there's lots, and for Kāinga Ora, we've got lots of really important, really interesting projects around passive house. We've got a project called Ngā Kāinga Anamata, which is going up to COP's virtual built pavilion. It's a 5 systems, looking at how we deliver those MB targets with 5 different construction systems. And so it's great, and it's really fantastic. The question is, how do we scale that up, and how do we do more? How do we talk about it more? And the one that I'm going to talk about, which I think people probably forget, is actually this Innovating Streets program that NZTA had. And those of you in New Zealand will have heard about it in various different guises. And I'm going to talk about it as a success, not necessarily because it delivered a whole bunch of innovative streets or new streets, but because it uncovered how we need to think about this going forward, and the challenges that we face with engaging communities in delivering that change system. So I think it's a really good example of what we need to do in terms of demonstrating some of these technologies, in inverted commas, or ways that we have and construct our cities and our environments. That's it from me for now.
Great, thanks, Helen. Oh, Helen, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, completely echo many of Alex's points. Particularly, we need to look at how we build, what we build, but also very much where we build. And I guess in terms of built environment, how we build and what we build, 2025 and even 2030, they're just around the corner. And in terms of the lifetime of built environment, 2050 is not that far off either. I think that thinking of sort of some of the challenges for the built environment sector, one of them is finding smart ways to overcome some of the inertia, some of them sort of the built-in ways that we do things. So really having a focus on bringing in innovative products and solutions to the sector, and doing it at pace without sacrificing quality, but doing that at pace, really thinking smarter about how we build. And we support sort of a move towards slightly more of a systems approach for building that's evidenced by Building for Climate Change and some of the programs in place to change some of the regulations around building. Thinking specifically about our organisation as an industry player, we were asked to think of what the biggest challenges are. For us, it's the very direct one of emissions, direct emissions and indirect emissions associated with what we do. So for our organisation, in setting a science-based target, it's great to have a target, it's great to have it aligned with a well below 2 degrees future, but actually the roadmap, the more important thing is the how, the roadmap of how you actually get there. And I think for all players, really, sort of granularity about the challenges you face and how you're going to address them is important to achieving the reduction. So that looks very different for us between construction, where transport emissions are actually a really big part of the carbon footprint of that aspect of our business. Whereas if you go over to building products, moving into embodied carbon, it's sort of the process heat that's associated with making the products that's the challenge. And the effective solutions, some of them are proven and in the marketplace, and some of them aren't quite there yet. So it is actually important, and we support the fact the government is putting in funding through ECA and other bodies sort of to help some of the more intractable problems get solved. So some of the decarbonisation funding and some of the energy transition acceleration support that's coming in is helpful. And we need to recognise that, in fact, in some sectors, and transport would be one, there are solutions available. It's a question of people adopting them and putting them in place and moving with the speed that's necessary. So really looking at when you can physically start to transition your vehicle fleet and actually starting to do that. I think that some of the solutions will come in from best practice overseas, and I know Sean and Fiona will be talking to that. But there are brands and NGBC sort of providing solutions within New Zealand. And in terms of sort of what some of those solutions look like, I think models like the Watercare Enterprise model are a great example of an infrastructure project that has a target, quite a challenging target, but relies on the collaboration between the client and the partners and the designers in that collaboration to come up with a solution. So I think it won't be a selection of sort of solutions that then you apply into the various built environment projects that are happening in New Zealand. I think it will be looking for a solution that fits the project you're in and just sort of cherry picking all the good technologies that are out there. However, having said that, there are obviously some overarching aspects like having energy transitions available in the market that people can draw on. There are definitely some overarching things where I think all players need to be pushing for government to make those transitions around how we provide energy to buildings, and also it's good to see things like a biofuels roadmap for transport coming in as proposals from government. There are some solutions that do need to be done at that strategic cross-sector scale, which I guess brings me to my final point, that it's pretty fundamental that however that comes about for New Zealand, it's got to be a just transition. It can't be something that simply shifts the burden onto perhaps families with higher transport needs, families in housing that's less energy efficient. So we need to look at how those sector-wide transitions play out to society as a whole, and that means sort of understanding that while we can focus very directly on carbon emissions, there's a lot of interlinked issues that have a flow-on effect, and we need to recognise that. And I guess I'll stop there, but yeah, I'm just fascinated, Fiona, to hear what your thoughts are on the subject.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, I echo some of many of the comments you've made, actually. I think especially in terms of the biggest challenges that the sector faces for climate change being around innovation and pace and moving an entire kind of ecosystem. We are in a climate revolution, and the sector needs to pivot fast. We don't have the luxury of time, and the sector doesn't normally move that fast. So this is a massive challenge, and it does impact and penetrate into all aspects of the sector. I think we're operating in an ecosystem that defines success largely by cost, time, and quality, and we're adding carbon to that, and also trying to make sure that we meet our social responsibilities in terms of biodiversity and well-being. So there's a lot of things happening, and at the moment we don't really have finely tuned mechanisms for doing that. We're building them, but we're not there yet, and we have to shift fast at the same time. And in terms of the biggest challenges that I see for the sector at the moment generally is rapid upskilling, so that we can move with collective action. And that does affect everyone in the supply chain, replacing that sense of complacency and BAU with urgency and the skills to actually deliver new thinking. I think we've had some recent projects where, although the architect, the engineer, and the client are all willing to go above and beyond to deliver really leading climate outcomes, it only takes a few kind of in that system to not be quite there yet, and it falls down. So we really need to bring everyone along on this journey together. The second biggest challenge, unfortunately, what I see a lot of is cost. So thinking about what financial levers and how can we incentivize climate conscious design, I think is really important. Incentives as well as disincentives. Something that I'd really like to see is potentially increased development opportunities as an incentive for carbon conscious design. And there's many other exciting incentives at the moment as well happening: sustainability linked lending, green bonds, TCFD reporting, which I think we're starting to see a big change coming through from our clients in terms of what they want and their assets to deliver to meet those incentives. And the other part that I think helps as kind of an antidote to BAU is following an integrated design process. So making sure that the right team is engaged really early and sets off together in a new path towards a really clear goal. In terms of good solutions that I see coming forward and where there is a need for more of a focus, starting to see some really exciting developments globally that are carbon negative or positive, depending on where in the world you're from, how you term that. But that's really exciting. But I think what we need to do is to consider what that means in Aotearoa and Auckland. What does carbon negative design look like for us? The players that I see that are leading this, listed companies seem to be leading the drive, as well as education clients, and putting themselves really out there and being part of driving that change and bringing everyone along on that journey. But what we do need to do is partner and work together with these companies to help accelerate this change. And we need to be having more conversations around budgets, carbon budgets, goals, and sharing the data so that we can all learn faster together, so that we can shift this whole ecosystem that is the sector towards climate conscious design. And this isn't a technical or a tools challenge, this is a cultural challenge and a change in values. I'd like to see the sector be more ambitious by setting really clear, ambitious targets and goals, having carbon briefs that have really clear targets for operational and embodied carbon, but also positive social impacts. And I think when we start to have these conversations, we'll start to understand more about value over cost. And when we start to identify the why in these carbon briefs, we'll start to change the conversation. And I think then we'll start looking at how we can deliver on that purpose. And an alternative design might not meet the brief. Sorry. If we're looking at putting forward proposals, we want them to be delivering value, not just to be on budget. So I think once we look at the purpose in terms of a brief, we'll start to make sure that we're really delivering the positive change we want to see. And the final comment I'd like to make is around procuring projects in a slightly different way that gives more time upfront for that integrated design process to enable innovation and design thinking to happen collectively at the start.
Thanks, Fiona. I think that's my cue. So I just a couple of sort of perspectives on what I've been seeing in the sort of European context. I think, you know, a couple of mentioned systems and systems innovation. You know, working at a systems level is really complicated, and it requires new skills, new ways of approaching things, an ability to kind of see across something and see patterns and see connections across really complex things: finance, education, health, air quality, carbon trajectories. All those elements, regulation and policy, all those aspects come part of the system, and you're seeing in Europe, you know, these terms of levers of change. So pull one lever, what's the outcome that you can get across the system? And that's why systemic innovation is such an important aspect of what we're seeing in the European context. I think also on the challenge side is, you know, governments and regulatory bodies just having the courage to regulate and to actually put in place the policy that's required to stimulate the market long term. You know, markets are looking for that security, that surety, that once they've invested in a particular approach, it might be mass timber, for example. In New Zealand's context, a lot of raw material there. It's a lot of capex to prepare the supply chain for Kaingaroa to be ready to receive that system in its part of its supply chain. But in order for industry to be ready for that, it needs surety. So we're seeing innovation occur in policy sandboxes, for example, a really useful instrument for bringing together the stakeholders, industry, policy, regulation, etc., finance into a place to experiment around what that might be. I think the willingness to collaborate has been mentioned as well, and working in an open source way. It's fundamental that data sources are open source, that they can be shared, and that factors from from across the supply chain can be interrogated in an open and transparent way, but also that those data sets are available for the SME sector. I mean, the SMEs at the small end of small, medium-sized enterprises, that you're talking 5-10 people, not necessarily having R&D and sustainability departments, and being able to sort of, and that's where a lot of the value is created, having the funds, the know-how, etc., to be able to access those. That's a big that's a big challenge. The good solution side of things, I think just be aware of being myopic on carbon. We can get to net zero, but we then may have a biodiverse desert. So just balancing again back to the system of, if we want to get to net zero, then not just taking that trajectory on its own, that as there could be perverse outcomes in just getting to the zero, and not just getting to the zero carbon, because that's very, very difficult, but being aware of some of the peripheral things that can happen along that way. I think there's good stuff happening in terms of what we're seeing as mission innovation. So I think Alec mentioned it at the beginning, the important citizen first, the people that will be benefiting from the innovation that this panel puts together, understanding what it is that we're trying to achieve. So a mission like a plastic-free ocean, everyone understands what that mission is. But if we start to talk about a zero carbon 2050 or 2030, they don't necessarily understand it, get it, and want to be a part of it. People understand things like air quality much more than they do zero carbon. Is what we're seeing from the European perspective. I think there's a lot of inspiration for New Zealand in the Nordic context. Very similar in terms of climate in some ways, very biodiversity focused, just putting a lot of investment into timber as well. Some of the mission that's occurring around the countries of Denmark and etc. They seem very parallel to what New Zealand has the potential to kind of learn some things from. So those would be my my reflections, I think, from at 10:30 in the evening in Milan periphery for the team so far.
And before we go into questions, can I just jump on a comment, Sean, that you've just made, which is fantastic. You'll understand we've been doing a whole series of events over this last couple of weeks, but there was a session last week, and it talked about how we need an emotional connection for people around climate. Climate action requires that emotional connection, and the comment you made around what resonates and this mission oriented, what does that sound like? And I think that's really critical for the built environment, for any kind of climate action. What is resonating, and recognizing that different groups in our system may find a different point of resonance and might have a different voice that resonates with them. And so I think that's one thing, and no doubt we'll talk about it, in how we can drive some of this collective action is making sure that we don't just have, like your point, one goal or one target. We actually recognize there's a breadth of opportunities in what we're trying to achieve.
Great, Alec. And that was the start of like the panel discussion. So you just started on your own, which was great. So maybe we just roll with that then. So there were a number of consistent themes that were coming through. One of them was the, I guess, how you frame it. What is this? What does it look like? So now, I guess the question is, how should we frame this challenge? If it's not going to be just about greenhouse gases and carbon, what is the framing of the challenge? What does it look like? How do we describe it? How do we shape it? How do we present it? Who wants to go first?
I mean, if I would just jump in and let it go, because I think that element of the built environment delivers a whole bunch of outcomes for the people in that environment. I think one of the things that we fail to talk about a lot, in New Zealand in Aotearoa, we have this focus on transport emissions, but the critical element that drives those transport emissions is the built environment. Is where are we? Where do we need to go? What do we need to do? So I think that breadth of outcomes is really critical. And I think, and I can't remember whether it was you, Helen, or Fiona, the equity component. That is so critical. Some of the transitions that we need to see are really difficult for people. So how do we actually do it in a way that helps people along, whether that's the communities or, to Sean's point, the smaller businesses who have some fantastic ideas and need that support from bigger organizations like Kāinga Ora in terms of, let's actually back those innovative ideas. Let's support them going through. So I think without a doubt, framing this challenge as bigger than just buildings in isolation or carbon in isolation, and the opportunity to create, a future that is more beneficial for a whole range of different people, I think has got to be, part and parcel of how we, meet those short-term carbon targets or the long-term ones. But without that broader context, people aren't going to be engaged. They're not going to get enthused. They're not going to have that mission to jump behind.
I wanted to add to that because I think framing the challenge gives, I guess, the sense of urgency and the sense of engagement. But it's incredibly important to show people that there is, in fact, something that they can do. So I think that framing the challenge is important, but showing that there's an actual how. There are some things you can either, request that happen in your community or in your country, but also there are things you can do. And I think a big part of getting through the challenge is coming up with those solutions that are sort of as frictionless as possible. So doing, even if they're small things, doing the smart things consistently and well. And I often think of the analogy of, if you've lived somewhere that has really great public transport, it's frictionless for you to do that rather than any other choice, but it also has those benefits in terms of your emissions. For those of you who are old enough to remember the days before curbside recycling, where you took all recyclables and sort of schlepped them somewhere to be recycled, the frictionlessness of that is something to embrace. And I think it's really difficult to think of what those solutions are. So those sort of community-wide solutions are that are largely frictionless. So people aren't having to make an active choice, you're just doing something that's a little bit lower carbon. But it's a big part of the solution, I think, as well as sort of engagement on the big priorities. Putting in some of the how that's effective is a big part of the solution. And I think that's where sort of transport transitions of what the fuels are for transport and energy, they're pretty important because they are largely frictionless. And also, as a number of people pointed out, where you build and what you build and how that community works together is very much part of the solution. Thinking in a smart way about either putting communities near public amenities and good transport, or putting good transport near communities that are underserved.
Great. Oh, Fiona?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think for me, the idea of how we frame the challenge is very, needs to be a bespoke approach, and it depends if it's at a project scale or a city scale. But the idea that at the outset, asking the right questions, so engaging with the people who are going to use that space or facility, and understanding what drives them or what drives that company as the client. And really starting to align with a clear mission statement for the project about the purpose, and thinking about sustainability as a whole. So making sure we do have that systems thinking that is economic, social, and environmental. I think most drivers will be somewhere in that space, and it's about identifying kind of what that thread is and pulling it in to deliver a much wider beneficial project But I think, yeah, asking the right questions to enable a bespoke approach that really does connect with people, to me, is key.
And Fiona, if we jump on, I mean, that's a really important question around how do we do that in a way that doesn't just amplify the voices of the now, and how do we actually do it in a way that reflects what, you know, this future environment for many people is different, is a change, is a shift. So how do we do that? And I think that kind of dovetails in with a comment around political leadership. You know, how do we push through some of this? And I'd be interested, Sean, you know, some of your reflections, obviously being in Europe, where we've seen, you know, that push through some of those big cities. We think about Paris, we think about Mayor Hidalgo, we think about even what's happening in London and the mayor there. You know, we need that, and we need that push through. But it takes leadership, hey? It takes ambition, and it takes a yeah, you know, I'm going to get some flack, but actually this is the right thing to do, so we're going to push through that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the story, I mean, Paris, just picking that one, Anne Hidalgo, and, you know, obviously her reinventing Paris, you know, it ended up being reinventing cities, and I think, you know, reinventing cities touched Auckland as well, which was, you know, the city providing the space, the land, the piece of the city that it wanted the innovation to occur on, and then, you know, and setting the bar really high for that, much higher than the current sort of regulatory piece, to see what, you know, what could happen there. And in the case of Paris, I mean, you know, over 100 projects touching Paris in different ways. Now Paris has, you know, a completely different building code as a result. So yeah, the lessons and learning from that, and applying that same kind of frame to New Zealand, and New Zealand giving it its own particular flavor, is really, you know, a really exciting potential, because that, you know, that the thinking there was 10 years ago. So we've sort of moved on a lot since then. But I think that, you know, if we want New Zealand to kind of leapfrog, then data sets, which are, I mean, this is the boring revolution. There's nothing super exciting about data sets, but once they're invested in and they're available for mitigation pathways, for carbon abatement curves to be done, to, you know, for others to then plug into, then you get the comparability, and you get, you know, TCFD sort of really engaging with it. It becomes such a fundamental base for any of the work that you do in the carbon in the carbon space. So you know, and that need not be industries responding. It may be that there's a lot of innovation within the university sector that can add into that space, you know, as well.
Okay, I'm just gonna stop for a second and just say, for anybody who's got any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We'll have time for a little bit. We've been on quite a journey here in terms of having some conversations around the framing, you know, talking about actually the importance of the collaborative design and the openness, and people coming together. We've, you know, got ourselves into leadership and data sets. One thing that's run through from what all four of you have said, and through some of this, is the importance of understanding the interdependencies of things, or looking at this a whole lot wider. This isn't about a building. This isn't about a road. This is actually about all of the things that are in some way influenced by or influencing the physical realm. So I hear hey, yeah, we need to do that when we go out to the outside world, but how do you do that within your organization? How well do you get your organization, or how do we get the organization working, whether it be public or private or you know, not for profit? How well do we get organizations to be comfortable with that level of complexity? Sean talked about it before, you know, systemic change, great, that's where we need to be, but it's complex and it's challenging. And so because it's complex, it means it's often very difficult for people to grasp and say, yeah, we want to do that. Not all at once, one at a time.
I don't know. I know Helen was wanting to say something, but I think that you've got to acknowledge that complexity, and I think where we can, and this is some of the stuff that we're trying to do. There's a Kaingora, and prior to that, it counts as well. Is there's a maturity of the organization, right? And it's kind of like how do we help people? Because there's a lot of people within organizations who are like, yeah, climate change is really important, but I actually don't know a lot about it. So it's inherent on people like Helen and Fiona and Sean and myself and anyone in this webinar, I suppose, to kind of try and bring it down a couple of notches and say, well, these are the kinds of questions we need to ask. Here's a project, to Fiona's point, here's a project. Are we thinking about like the emissions? Are we thinking about these broader benefits? Or are we just using the same old templates that we've used for the past 10, 15 odd years? Sean's point about the building code, I mean, that's a minimum. That's like the minimum that we should be doing. And the opportunity is to do a lot more and deliver a whole bunch more benefits. So I think at an organizational level, it's inherent to question and challenge and go, well, is this enough? And here are some tools, like simple questions that we can maybe add into that as a starting point to go, have we thought about this? Have we thought about that? So for me, that's kind of this maturity at an organizational level that we need to help with. And the fantastic thing is that there are more and more people within organizations. I just looked at the fact that we have a panel here with a GM of sustainability, a director of sustainability, which we haven't had, 2, 3, 4 years ago. So we have these roles, and it's really contingent on us and others to really push hard on those kinds of questions that we need to add.
Alec, I guess my question is more, so that's great in terms of sustainability, climate, and action, and being able to explain it so people understand it. But if you're saying actually this isn't just about climate and sustainability, it's about 30 or 40 different things and how they relate to each other, how does that get understood and embedded in how the organization works?
I think, and sorry, hogging, but I guess that's for me, and I've talked a lot about sustainability as a way of thinking, not just about the outcomes and the outputs that you're trying to achieve, and actually getting a reframe to say, actually, yes, we can talk about outputs, which is your climate output or whatever, but actually it's the way that we're just approaching the topic and the way that we're thinking about, longer term outcomes or this interconnectivity of the decision that you're making. And I think that as a way of thinking rather than just the outputs is kind of the shift that we need to see within organizations.
I think also I had a couple of thoughts on sort of getting through complexity, and I guess for organisations. So when we first started looking at what we could do in the broader field of sustainability, and we talked about the sea of issues. You could drown in the sea of, the sea of things you could do is vast. So how do you manage sort of not drowning in the sea of issues? And I guess it's going to come down to what really matters to you. I mean the big you as an organisation, you and your stakeholders and your investors, but also where can you actually make a meaningful change, and that reduces complexity. The other thing that reduces it a lot to my mind is, and I think it's part of the solution as well, is what is the horizon that you're looking at? Because the longer the horizon is that you're looking at, in terms of your decisions for projects, if you stretch that out, then actually some solutions, which solutions look attractive in the short term, are very different from those that look attractive in the long term. So taking a longer time frame to look at what's a smart thing to do in terms of whether it's climate or biodiversity is really helpful. And it's one of the things that, as Fiona's mentioned, the investment community is starting to drive that longer term thinking. And Sean's mentioned the need to sort of crunch that data, look at MAC curves, look at sensible projects. But if you look at that over a longer time frame, some things that wouldn't be considered on a 1 year perspective come to the fore in the longer term. And that change of perspective does really simplify some of the complexity. It simplifies it quite a lot, we've found from our own direct experience.
Great. Jana?
I was going to add, sometimes the challenge can seem absolutely massive and all-encompassing, and it is. And I think that can be really off-putting, and people feel like they don't understand everything, so that they can't talk about it, which can really hold back progress. So something that I like to discuss with people is about every single role in a company and in society. There's something that we can do, and kind of if we don't know what that is, we need to find out and ask that question about what we can do better in our role and how that role plays a part in that wider ecosystem. And I think alongside that, although we now do have these fantastic roles like Director of Sustainability, the responsibility of sustainability doesn't just sit with that person. It is the responsibility of everyone. And we do, really need to think hard about what we can all do in all of our roles and all of our lives, I think, to contribute and try to keep it simple, just one thing that you can do.
Great. Okay, I'm going to thank you, team. I'm going to move over to the panel questions, because I mean the audience questions, because there's a few of those. But I'm just going to put in one comment. So I was on a panel last week around the emergence of sustainable finance and what that looks like for climate finance and the rest. And a big part of that conversation was actually, the world of capital and investment is actually making a big push, and a lot of that's driven by a reframing of value, reframing of it not just being value being money's for money's sake and we make more money and who cares what happens, to actually how we live and what we do with our investment, with our capital, needs to pay back, but it also needs to deliver something positive, and that's really about how we collectively say what's important to us. Okay, so I'm going to pick a couple of questions and then put it over to you, panel. First one is around new build, all good. What about existing building stock? 70+% of which will still be around in 2050. If we don't address poor performing existing buildings, we will not achieve decarbonisation targets. So what are thoughts on that?
Yes.
Agree.
Yes, we have to. I think it leads to some really interesting questions, though, about is retrofit the right answer, or do we need to look in other locations? So you kind of have this dual element of reducing the emissions, the operational emissions, but then also are these houses in places that are going to be flood risk areas or flood prone? And so there's some really challenging questions that we have, and I'm sure others have, in terms of that existing housing stock. What is the best way of transitioning, and also considering that anything that we do has a disruptive effect on the people in those houses. So again, goes back to that equity point. How do we challenge and change? So that's my thought. Just to jump on your comment about financing, Ian, I think the question there is to push harder. So I was on a similar discussion about green mortgages as an intervention, and it's great, in terms of lower or better performing houses. But can we go a step further and think about green mortgages that drive you to locations as well? Not just the building itself, but maybe some kind of discounting for properties that aren't in climate risk areas or are in intensification areas that are driving those outcomes. So even pushing that finance arena further to deliver those outcomes, I think is really important. But back to your retrofit, yeah, definitely. But it's a really important question about what is the best way, and to, I think, Helen, your point, not just kind of building stuff that actually in the future is not going to be sufficient for the lives that people want to leave or the climate that we're gonna see.
Yeah, I can add something just on the retro. I mean, Europe is old, and so it won't meet its trajectory without addressing the existing buildings, and it has the heritage and listed element as well, which makes the typology. So basically, if you have one typology and you pump out a whole lot of solutions on that typology, then it's you want option A, B, C, D. It's very, very straightforward. But when the built environment is as varied as it is, and when it has listed buildings as well, it becomes a little bit more complicated, but not impossible. So the lesson, I think, understand the typologies, have systems that are ready to be deployed at scale across those, have funds available that can be drawn down, that paid back over a sort of 15-20 year sort of period. Look at what the Netherlands have done, where the debt is not attached to the individual but attached to the property. So that completely changes the transaction. There's systems like Energy Sprong as well, which are kind of really sort of spreading quite wide in Europe. And then don't forget, you know, the building sits within a district. So if you can get a street to be retrofitted, the outcome it then allows all that wonderful interplay in the public realm to be addressed as well, and you know, get all the sort of health outcomes occurring linked to that as well. Would be some of my suggestions there.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one, but as I do, I have a quick opinion on that last one, which is I think a lot of it's around the value stuff as well, because a lot of the old buildings actually have people in them who have health problems and wider issues. So actually, you know, fixing the home for climate change is actually fixing the home for wider social issues. Okay, so here's a good question here. Sean, you mentioned they put supply chains and innovative, sustainable building products. Helen, we were talking about needing to go at pace, and so Mike says domestically we have some supply chain issues which are exacerbated by our industry structure. How do we shift this at pace and get people buying into and demanding sustainable building products? Well, I guess, yeah, having supply chain so that it makes it easy for people to be able to build.
I guess part of it is that the incentive is that you get a better house or a better product at the end of it. So sort of shifting towards, there's a number of benefits to using more modern ways of constructing, right? So designing in digital, making more use of modular construction, whether that's entire houses or components of. There's a whole lot of benefits to that, but one of them is that you have, you know, higher quality, good energy performance, but also quite a lean supply chain as a result of building in that way rather than sort of the traditional way. So I think taking an approach that's more efficient in terms of all resources doesn't totally fix the supply chain issue, but it certainly mitigates it. And it probably, I would imagine, as those solutions come to the fore in the market and people, you know, want that house that's high quality and warmer and drier, it probably transforms the market a little bit to different kinds of products as well. So, so that's, I think, definitely changing the way we construct to being smarter is part of the fix for supply chain as well.
And
Helen, just throw something in, sorry, Ian, just to jump across. I think one of the things that we're going to have to, it goes back to your complexity question, and there's an issue here where as society we've tried to look at efficiency, and efficiency generally means fewer and fewer options. So how do we make our supply chain more efficient? But with the complexity, we need to have a lot more options. We need variety, we need flexibility. So actually, yes, of course, we want to try and make it easier for our supply chains, but actually supply chains are going to have to also be a lot more responsive. You've got this funny grunt. Sorry, I'm doing some sort of weird hand movements.
But dance. It's like
yeah, but you've got to move on both axes, right? So yes, we've got to make it a little bit more simple, but also our supply chains are going to have to deal with whether it's a climate complexity or a COVID or some other disruption. This is something that we're going to have to get better at managing. You know, how do we do that? So I totally agree, like signals that we need to send, but that's kind of the principle of this 5 systems project that Kāinga Ora is leading on, is, you know, 5 different building systems that will achieve the building for climate change goals. And so knowing that there's a range of ways of getting there is going to be quite important. And to Sean's point, you know, not every building is the same. So we actually probably do need lots of different solutions for different environments and different situations. So it kind of is this complexity that in some way, as we talked about earlier, we've got to get better at managing as well.
We've had so many things that we've only just scratched the surface on, I have to say. So it feels almost wrong that we have to wrap up, but we do have to wrap up. So I'm going to start by saying a huge thank you to the panel, Alec, Helen, Fiona, and Sean. Thank you very much for sharing and engaging. It really does feel like it's the start of something bigger. So hopefully, we can continue this conversation. We can find other forum and bring other people to the table to do this. I'd also like to thank Auckland Unlimited for hosting, and to highlight again that those on the call, that Auckland Unlimited team establishing the cross-sector climate innovation hub, which will have the built environment as one of the thematic focus areas. And finally, a big shout out to Michelle and the Auckland Climate Festival team for the huge personal effort to create this festival, which is amazing. So thank you all, and have a good day.
Thank you.